Welcome to the launch of the Greater Manchester State of the VCSE Sector 2021 report. I'm Alison Page. I'm the Chief Exec of Salford CVS and I'm a founder director of the 10GM Partnership, and more on that later. This morning we'll be explaining the background to the research, the methodology and the key findings. We'll also be outlining some key recommendations developed through the insight we have gained. You'll be able to download a short briefing document and the full report from the GMCVO and 10GM websites today, and that information will be put in the chat. And we're really pleased that so many people could join us today. And we're especially pleased to welcome you all, but I am really pleased to welcome colleagues from our partner organisations from the State of the Sector Steering Group, including John Hannon, who's the incoming CEO at Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation, GMCVO, and my colleague from Salford CVS, Marie Wilson, who's led as the project manager for this work, and they'll be running us through the headline findings. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Michelle Howarth from the University of Salford, who've been our academic partner for this research. Just looks at her notes now. We are really pleased, and we only managed to finalise this at last minute, that Andy Burnham, who's the Mayor of Greater Manchester, as you all know, will join us today at 11:10 for a short while, so he can explain to us why he thinks the VCSE sector is important to Greater Manchester. And we'll then come back together for two short panel discussions, which will be chaired by Liz Windsor-Welsh from Action Together. The first panel will feature Councillor Aruj Shah, who's the leader of Oldham Council, and she's also the political lead for the VCSE sector at the Combined Authority. Aruj will be joined by Andrew Lightfoot, the Deputy Chief Exec of Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and Warren Heppelet, the Executive Lead at Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership. We've then got a second panel with some of my local infrastructure colleagues, Helen Tomlinson, the Deputy CEO at Bolton CVS, Sajid Hashmi from Interim CEO at Bury VCFA, Joe McGrath from CEO at Sector 3 in Stockport, and Mike Weil, the CEO at Mac in Manchester. And we'll end today's event with some concluding remarks and recommendations from John Hannon, GMCVO. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for attending and to everyone who's made today possible. And there's lots and lots of people behind the scenes who've worked really hard to get us to this point. But I particularly want to thank all of those voluntary organisations, community groups, charities and social enterprises who took time out at the height of the pandemic to respond to our survey and attend online focus groups. This event is to highlight them, their role and contribution in making Greater Manchester a better place. So I think Marie is going to put us some slides up now. So as you can see from the slides, this event marks the launch of the Greater Manchester State of the VCSE Sector 2021 report. But you'd think one report was enough, wouldn't you? But oh no, we've gone for 11. So each of the 10 Greater Manchester localities, the local authority areas, will then launch their own State of the Sector reports from tomorrow. So they'll come out over the next few days. So the research has been commissioned through a collaboration, and that's been led by Salford CVS. But all local infrastructure organisations have worked together in Greater Manchester since 2012 to undertake State of the Sector research and evaluation. And this time our partnership has comprised Action Together in Oldham, Rochdale and Tameside, Bolton CVS, Mac in Manchester and Salford CVS, who currently make up the 10GM partnership, and our local infrastructure partners Sector 3 in Stockport and Bury VCFA, GMCVO of course, and this is the Greater Manchester State of the Sector launch, and Trafford and Wigan local authorities. Next slide please. So the findings of the previous State of the Sector research, which in Greater Manchester was 2013 and 2017, they have been used widely across the city region and within each locality throughout the last almost 10 years now to describe the contribution of the sector, its makeup and the work it does. But for this iteration of the State of the Sector, we have worked with a new academic partner, the Centre for Social and Health Research at the University of Salford. And they've done it slightly differently, and they have undertaken a realist evaluation. And Michelle will talk about that shortly. So our survey and focus groups, as I said, took place during the height of the pandemic, at a time when our sector were playing both a key strategic role in local emergency structures, whilst also mobilising local people and local groups, using our ability to reach, scale and spread to deliver a humanitarian response to the crisis. So I think it's really important to recognise that we've got to this stage during a pandemic. So we now want to present to you our story, the methodology behind the research, the summary findings and insight that capture the Greater Manchester picture, and share with you our recommendations for the future. Next slide, please, Marie. So I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Michelle Howarth, who, like me, is really pleased to have done this, but pleased also to when it will be completed. And Michelle is the lead researcher for this work from the Centre for Social and Health Research at the University of Salford. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks for that introduction. I have to say it's been an honour to work alongside our partners in the VCSE sector on this really important state of the sector survey. So yeah, it's been tough going, but enjoyable, and I hope the findings make a real difference to you out there. So it's my job to describe the survey, the methodology, and provide some examples of the calculations used to help illustrate the rigour of the survey and subsequent findings. And don't worry, it won't last all morning. I'm presenting on behalf of Dr. Graham Sheriff, Phil Martin and Dr. Paul Hepburn, who were instrumental in the analysis of the data but can't be here today. So next slide, please, Marie. The survey included 8 sections which encourage respondents in each of the 10 GM localities. And we use this to describe their organisations and the paid workforce, the volunteers, the number of social enterprises and the impact. We also evaluated the work that the VCSE sector undertook in each locality and the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic. So in total, the survey included 104 questions to capture accurate and representative data about the sector. We used, as Alison's mentioned, a realist evaluation as the framework for the survey. So realist evaluation is built on 3 key principles, which includes explicating the context, the mechanisms and the outcomes, i.e. what works, how and for who. So in terms of the context, the university research team undertook a desk-based review of contemporary literature to describe the VCSE sector and present an analysis of the political, historical, societal and health influences. And this review also explicated the extent and impact of COVID-19, Brexit and Black Lives Matter, providing findings that describe how organisations have repurposed in the light of these changes. So there was quite a lot going on in 2020, as we all know, and the context therefore is really important and is included at the start of each report. In terms of the mechanisms, we use the survey to understand what the VCSE sector does and for whom. And we also undertook focus groups within the localities, within theme groups, to capture qualitative data about the mechanisms and outcomes for the VCSE sector. And in terms of those outcomes, we measured the workforce, the extent of partnership working, and explored how organisations have worked and supported communities during the pandemic. We used the quantitative Likert scale and single multiple response questions alongside the qualitative data. And we later triangulated this to provide a holistic representative picture of the VCSE sector. In terms of the robustness and quality, we built on Sheffield Hallam's methodology. And we also use validated tools such as the Office of National Statistics for population size and workforce calculations, and the Greater Manchester Social Enterprise Survey that was undertaken in 2020 to provide contemporary evidence-based findings. Next slide, please, Marie. Thank you. So we calculated the margin of error between 6 and 10% across the localities. And this helped to establish how precise the findings were and to what extent the results actually reflected the spread of data around a standard deviation. To increase the confidence in the results, based on our margin of error, we set a 95% confidence interval. So, as previously mentioned, in estimating the size and total number of the organisations in each locality, we use validated data from a range of sources as described here. We also use the NCVO parameters for organisations that make up to help determine the size of the organisation. So, for example, micro-organisations considered to be that brings in less than 10,000 a year. A small is between 10 and 100,000 a year. Medium is between 100,000 and 1 million. And a large organisation generates income of more than 1 million per year. So respondents were asked to indicate their income, and we use that to stratify the organisations by size. We then had to use descriptive statistics to estimate geographical coverage, organisational maturity, and a range of other things, which I'll get to in a minute. And we also extrapolated data to estimate income, population size, and workforce. Next slide, please, Marie, thanks. So here's a worked up example for Greater Manchester, which can be found in the reports. So you can see here the estimated population of Greater Manchester is 2,835,686. And according to the UK Register of Charities in England and Wales, there are approximately 3,635 registered charities in Greater Manchester. It's estimated that there are 3.66 below the radar organisations per 1,000 population, and that was based on Moe and Attell's calculation in 2010, which Sheffield also used. And that indicates that there are approximately 10,400 below the radar organisations in Greater Manchester. The Greater Manchester survey that I mentioned before of social enterprises estimated that there are about 3,459 social enterprises operating across Greater Manchester. And this figure excludes registered charities. So summing up, there's 17,494 VCS organisations, of which 71% are micro, 16% are medium, 10% are small, and 3% are large. Next slide, please, Marie. So we also asked respondents to identify their three main areas of work and who the key beneficiaries were and how they made a difference to people's lives. So, for example, community development, services, wellbeing, health and social care, and a range of other activities. And we asked respondents to indicate in which year their organisation was formed. So this was to ascertain the level of organisational maturity as an indication of how established the VCSE sector is in the locality and across GM. So there are a couple of examples on this slide here that demonstrate how this has been reported in, presented in the reports. Next slide, please, Marie. Thank you. So we used certain statistics in the reports that were extrapolated from the survey responses to provide estimates of totals for all organisations. So these include, as represented in the chart opposite, the number of organisations, the number of volunteers, committee and board members, and the number of full-time equivalents. I think it's important to understand how we extrapolate the data. So Marie, could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So, as I mentioned earlier, we built on the same methodology as Sheffield Hallam, and we use the same four-stage approach. So this is a random sample here. This doesn't represent data, actual data. So in stage one, the Greater Manchester averages were calculated for each of the four size bands of organisations, so those micro, small, medium and large. In stage two, the total number of organisations were then calculated by applying the relative proportions from the Sheffield study to the total number of organisations that we calculated using those validated data sets I mentioned earlier, so the ONS, the BTR and the GM survey. So in stage three, we then multiplied the estimated number within each size band by the average income to give the total income for each size band. And then finally in stage four, we were able to estimate the sum of the income for each size band to give a sector-wide total. So that gives you some indication of how we extrapolated the data. And again, that calculation and all that information is at the start of each report. But not all our data was extrapolated. Could you move to the next slide? Thank you. So in helping us to determine the future needs of the VCSE sector, we also asked specific questions about the workforce, partnerships and funding. For example, we asked respondents to tell us how many staff they employed, how many volunteers supported their organisation. We used the ONS data again to help us estimate the total number of paid employees and full-time equivalents. We also captured descriptive statistical data on the extent of the partnership working across GM and the 10 localities. And to do this, we included Likert scales, I can see here in this diagram, in the survey, which helped to describe how organisations worked across other VCSE sector organisations and across GM as a whole. We also used a similar approach to explicate sources of income and changes in workforce, which again are included in the report. The data were analysed by explicating the percentages as a whole and also triangulating the data with the qualitative findings from the focus group. So the two quotes that we've used here in this slide, we've just really highlighted the commonalities that emerge from the qualitative data in relation to the quantitative findings identified. So participants in the focus groups highlighted the need to work more closely with the private sector, which was also reflected in the quantitative findings. So the data is included in the future section of the report and helped to inform the final section, which we are pleased to say were written by the chiefs about the future direction of the VCSE sector. And also the data estimated in all the reports and in GM was used to generate key headlines for each locality and then extrapolated across GM. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to John Hannon and Marie Wilson, who are going to talk through the findings.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. So I'll just introduce the two of us. As Alison mentioned, I'm the incoming CEO of GMCVO. Next week, I'll be the actual CEO of GMCVO, so we've not quite got the timings right on that. But presenting alongside me will be Marie Wilson, who project managed this work. So you've got somebody who's actually an expert on this rather than somebody who thinks they're an expert. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some insight into some of the findings and a bit more context behind some of the data we've got. So we move on to the next slide. So I'll just briefly, before we get into some of the data and some of the kind of implications of that data, just talk about context for a little while. I'm sure none of this will be a surprise to you, but stuff went on in the last period of time. There's the whole issue around COVID, the fact that Brexit happened, and if we think where we were in December 19 and the kind of changes that we were kind of on the precipice of, and some of that has been missed in the impact of the pandemic, but there still are significant changes, and especially a lot of social changes for people, especially when the kind of right to remain in the country has been changed as well. But also we've had, especially kicked off with the murder of George Floyd in the US, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, but then the unequal impact of COVID. And what we need to recognise that although the pandemic was a new thing, some of this stuff isn't new. It's been stored up for a long time. I think some guy once said there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And a lot of this stuff didn't turn out of the blue. It'd been stored up for a while, and the dam burst and it got unleashed. And what we actually started to measure is some of the changes that have been happening over some time, but actually manifested themselves in this period of time. And what I do recommend, I always recommend reading long reports that I'm involved in, but it's really important to read this report because we do get a lot of information from focus groups and the real stories from people who gave us some real insight. So as much as there's quantitative data, there's actually some really good qualitative data and some stories of people there. And there's a quote that we just taken a brief snippet of here. At the height of COVID, we were supporting 200 people a week, and then overnight we became a food provider. And an organisation that was just basically saying, well, what do we do? How do we support people? And these are the issues that they need resolving, especially when the shielding was at its peak. And sometimes we forget almost that we've been through that because there's another problem and another problem that comes up. But we've actually managed to give a really interesting snapshot when we took information in the autumn. And there's a lot of really in-depth stuff, and especially over the unequal impact of COVID. And we've got to recognise that the unequal impact of COVID didn't happen because of the nature of the virus. It happened because of the nature of society. The inequality is there because of racism, patriarchy, class structures, all kinds of discrimination cause that inequality. It's not that they're just naturally occurring situations. So a lot of this data does tell us about that. And when we actually talk about the impact of COVID, we need to think about the impact on care, the amount of people who now have care burdens that they didn't have before. And that falls unequally as well on poor people, on women. And there's a whole set of issues that we're going to have to start unpicking, deal with as time goes on. So although we kind of almost treat as a fact that this stuff happened, we've actually got a really good set of data telling us the stories, and we need to actually think about those, reflect on those, and make decisions based on those as we go forward. So this isn't just telling us about the past, this is actually telling us about the state we're in now and the decisions we need to make. So if we go on to the next slide, and Marie, if you want to take over.
Thank you, John. as Michelle mentioned in a worked example, there's roughly 17,494 voluntary organisations in Greater Manchester. That includes community groups, charities and social enterprise, all making a difference in Greater Manchester. Now, in line with previous state of the sector research and research that takes place nationally, about 71% of those are micro-organisations. So that's income under £10,000. So those are the small groups that exist in localities, neighbourhoods and communities. We also have 19% of groups that identify as social enterprises, which is a growth compared to the previous research. There's a number of reasons behind this, but don't think of social enterprises as just large trading organisations. There's a growth in community interest companies, particularly over the last few years, and some of these are quite small and micro organisations as well. So it's not necessarily larger organisations emerging because of social enterprises. And although we have some great organisations that work on large locality footprints and across the city region, the majority of our sector, about 57%, work in particular neighbourhoods and communities where they've developed from and they're strongly rooted within. We did ask groups their top 3 areas of work, and as Michelle mentioned in the methodology, these were listed in the report, and the top 4 were wellbeing, health and social care, which includes everything from mental health support, caring, respite, right through to that whole ecosystem of providing activities and supporting social prescribing. We've got community development, which isn't just about place, but also communities of identity and working within those. Physical activity and sport also came out highly, and that again is in its broadest sense, not just competitive sport. It covers everything from your walking groups and new age curling through to your judo clubs and football leagues. And last but not least, economic well-being, which includes everything from employability through to debt advice supports, such as our fabulous colleagues at Citizens Advice, as well as all the poverty work that happens in our sector. So your food banks, your baby banks, your clothing schemes for schools, etc. Now, all these groups interlink. It's not a case of this is asylum and this group does X, but just to give you a flavour and the theme of the work that we do. Back over to John for the economics.
So we've just got 3 stats here, but each of these tells a much more complex story. The total income of the sector is £1.2 billion, and that's down. So we've actually got a larger sector, but with less money. And so that a lot of that is actually more spread and more dispersed. But I think there's also a real change in the structure of funding as well. So it's not just that everybody's had a small cut, it's that money has shifted. And a lot of that you can actually see when you go into the stats that Marie just talked about in terms of the kind of activities organisations take. It's been a massive growth in community development work, for example. That ties in with recognising the value of community development work in terms of preventing issues, making communities more resilient. And this was going on before the pandemic hit, but also with the growth in things like social prescribing and therefore the need for community activities to fit into that. And that changes the nature, the changes the operating environment we work in, changes the nature of activities. And so it really is important to not just see the figure, it's also important to look at the structure and where funding is going to. The vast majority of organisations have at least one source of non-public sector funding, but of those who actually are entirely dependent on public funding, most of them have more than one source. I think in this 2017 State of the Sector survey, there was 12% of organisations were reliant on a single source of public sector funding for 100% of their income. That's down to about 5% now. So there's actually a much more resilient sector in terms of the spread of income. But when we actually look at those non-public sector sources of funding, they aren't really large and widespread. It's very, very diverse. So, for example, 16% of organisations get funding from national lottery distributors, 23% from membership fees, and so there's no one single source of funding that actually comes in and supports the sector. So that does give us some level of resilience and that kind of diversity, but also it can make it a really hard job to actually stitch enough funding together for an organisation, and it's a job of work that are just keeping afloat. So although there's kind of good signs in terms of that sense of the diversity of funding into the sector, we've just got to recognise there's a burden in terms of generating that income as well. And obviously that's been impacted in the last year. So there's also a large number of organisations who weren't sure whether their income was increasing or decreasing because they were still in that process of just trying to work out what had just hit them. that last figure, 32% of organisations used their reserves in the last 12 months. That doesn't seem like quite a large figure, but actually it's kind of gargantuan in a sense. So as Marie mentioned, and Michelle mentioned before, 71% of the sector have got an income of less than £10,000. They don't really need to use reserves a lot of the time because they can just stop doing activities. They cut the cloth according to fit. But when I think if we look at some of the breakdown of employment within the sector, 19% of the sector are those medium to large organisations, and they're responsible, they have about 89% of the workforce. So if we've actually got 32% of organisations using reserves, that's a significant amount of the professional voluntary sector who are having to use reserves. It's important to recognise that when organisations use reserves, they've got to have reserves in the first place. So some of those organisations that are effectively on the breadline couldn't use their reserves, and they had to kind of stop doing things. Of those organisations that did use reserves, some were making investment into being able to work remotely. And so that's a one-off cost that allows them to continue to work. Some were kind of using funding to bridge income gaps. But others were actually using their reserves to provide new services. And some of that reserve use is actually self-funded responses to COVID to actually make a difference. And so as much as we've seen the impact of COVID on society and the response from funders, the response from the public sector, the voluntary sector has actually self-funded a lot of work that's gone into helping people out communities. But because that's come from reserves, that money has gone now. And so if we want some of those approaches to continue, if we want to look at the impacts of the pandemic as it goes forward, that money's been spent. The adjustments have been made to organisations. They've self-funded the work, and it can't be done a second time. And I say the focus groups provide us with a lot of useful information and people's stories. And so just a quote there about how face-to-face services stopped, and expenditure increased due to the safety measures. I'm sitting in the St Thomas Centre, the conference centre that GMCVO run, and we've had to, although we're open for business, we've had to reduce numbers, and therefore we can take less income, and we've had to spend more on PPE and other and cleaning costs as well. So it's going to be challenging going forward. We've actually got to this point. We've been resilient, but costs are going up as we go forward and income's going down. Okay, Marie?
Okay, moving on to an element of our workforce. The voluntary sector, at the heart of it, is our volunteers. And the research captured 496,609 volunteers, including all the committee members and trustees, given a huge amount of time per year. But I'm going to have a small caveat in that when we dig further, 74% of those total hours were in micro-organisations, because obviously they're the larger part of our sector. Combined with that, the fact that this is a snapshot at the height of COVID, when a lot of people were on furlough, a lot of people were volunteering for their mutual aid groups, their local community groups, because they wanted to do their bit to help with the pandemic. So this is quite a high figure. What we're seeing from both traditional academic research and post-emergency response, that will have a bounce. There will be a dip in volunteering and a decline in volunteering. We're starting to see initial signs of this through locality research, through the Salford CVS Pulse report, which asks sector leaders very basic questions. We're starting to see it through the NCVO barometer. So it is something we're going to have to keep a watching brief on. So whilst we've got a great healthy figure right now, I have to put a bit of an asterisk that it was through a very unusual time and may not be representative of our status moving forward. But on the positive, this was cost at £692 million per year based on the real living wage. I use the word costed rather than valued, because actually this is based on a pure transactional based on salary. It doesn't cover the true value of volunteering, either for the beneficiaries that received those services that they desperately needed, particularly in the height of 2020, but also the benefits of volunteering more broadly for the individual in terms of employability, skills development, reducing social isolation, and general individual well-being and belonging in communities. So I'm not going to dwell on the volunteering figure massively. I'm going to hand over to John for the further workforce and partnership work.
Thanks, Marie. So two main statistics here. 74% of organisations and employees pay the real living wage, which is great. A lot of our organisations are rooted in communities and employ people from their communities, and often there's a kind of conveyor belt between people who are beneficiaries who work for those organisations that it's important that people have an income that pays a decent wage and enables them to work and not work in poverty. Of the organisations that don't, we've got to recognise that some of that is down to the operating environment rather than the organisations themselves. If funders and commissioners aren't funding or commissioning at a level that allows the real living wage to be paid, it won't be paid because the nature of the cost or the nature of the volume of work that's created. So we've got to get that to be a higher figure. Then, as much as we can promote the concept of the real living wage within the sector, we've got to think about that operating environment as well. The next stat we've got is on partnerships and relationships, and it's really interesting that the number of organisations with links to local authorities is reducing, whereas it's growing with private businesses and with the voluntary organisations. Some of that is down to the impact of the pandemic, because there's that nature of things springing up within communities, and therefore the people who were first to find out were the people who were already working and living in those communities. But also, as we've seen the retrenchment of public funding through the years of austerity, then the amount of funding that comes from the public sector into the voluntary sector is reducing, and that's breaking some of those links because the funding relationship is being lost. And the resource to enable some of those relationships to develop and have the spare capacity to build relationships and not just focus on your work reduces as well. It's interesting about the relations with private businesses which are growing. I think what we saw was a massive response from business as well during the pandemic, with organisations, businesses and firms basically thinking back, well, how do we support the communities we work with and the communities we're rooted within as well? And the kind of employee-supported volunteering that came through that, and that sense of being in it together. And hopefully we can build on some of those relationships and take those forward. And it comes into one of our recommendations that we actually need to do more with business, and because that doesn't just change the nature of communities and community work, it changes the nature of business and changes the nature of the economy as well through that relationship. I think one final point I'd mention here about that relationship between voluntary organisations and the public sector. If you're in the public sector and you want to reach the voluntary sector, you're probably best doing it through the voluntary sector rather than directly, because that's where those relationships are. So understanding that the networks also exist within the voluntary sector. So this is a bit of a plug for some of us, the organisations who commission this research. We all maintain networks with the voluntary sector and do work with us and do work through us as we move forward into the future. So I'll finish with Marie, who's got a bit more insight and qualitative information from the focus groups.
Thanks, John. This is our last slide, and we really struggled on how to bring the thematic and qualitative research to life. Not because there wasn't some great research and some great stories. It was that, as Michelle mentioned in their methodology, there are almost too many great stories and narratives that we could explore with you guys as part of this launch and as part of the focus groups moving forward. Just had a bit more depth to the thematic analysis and the focus groups Michelle mentioned in the methodology. We did these in multiple ways and to try and get a multiple layer of stories. So some were locality based to try and get that place story out, and so focused on groups working in Stockport or Wigan, for example. But some were very much thematic, and those focused particularly on marginalised communities with Greater Manchester, and brought out some of the narrative regarding Black Lives Matters and the experiences of disabled people, etc. But before I talk about the focus groups, not focus groups, sorry, the breakout rooms, and explain those to you, I just wanted to leave you with two quotes, kind of to get the brain going and just to leave you a little bit of thinking time. So the first quote: the food bank we assist with was merely run by people that had to shield during COVID. So we had to step up to assist, stock, source, pack and deliver for them. We found people with multiple problems who would have slipped through the net. They were vulnerable, had mental health issues, isolated, debt problems, or were living in suitable properties. So echoing some of the things John said earlier about the dam breaking and uncovering problems that may have already been existing in communities or society. And the second quote from a leader: my staff, my volunteers are suffering as well. As pointed out earlier in the focus group, that's mental health. Because of the struggle we're having being able to deliver our services and the desire to get back to delivering our normal services, it creates frustration for them, it creates stress. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of some of the key findings. We've naturally focused on the statistics, but we've tried to bring out some of the thematic elements and some of the stories that are buried into the depth of the report. Do encourage you to read the report fully. As John said, there's so much more depth about our workforce and the stories of people during the 2020 that are really valuable to truly understand the state of the sector currently.